In 2021, a public university in India began offering a 2-year master's degree. Students would attend classes, submit assignment, sit and write examinations, and graduate with a postgraduate qualification, recognized by the University Grants Commission, funded in part by the state. The subject was astrology, a real master's degree that teaches students how to predict the future from the position of the planets. And it was approved by the same body that approves degrees in physics, medicine, and engineering. How can the same country that sent a spacecraft into Mars orbit on its very first attempt also fund a master's degree in predicting your future from your birth chart? But an astrology degree at a university isn't where this story ends. It is where it begins. Because once an idea becomes part of a university curriculum, it gains something most beliefs never have. It gains official approval. And that is where the real story begins. Before we go any further, we need to be fair. The basic idea behind Indian knowledge systems isn't ridiculous. In fact, much of it is true. India gave the world the decimal number system and the concept of zero, not just as a symbol, but as a number you could actually calculate with. Centuries before Newton and Leibniz developed calculus in Europe, mathematicians from the Kerala school were already working with mathematical ideas that later became part of calculus. In the 5th century, Aryabhata calculated the length of a year with remarkable accuracy, using nothing more than careful observations and mathematics. These aren't exaggerated nationalist claims. They are well-documented parts of the history of science, and if anything, they deserve to be taught more widely. So the idea of teaching India's scientific heritage is not the problem. In fact, it is a good idea. The problem is what happens next. Once that idea enters the curriculum, nobody stops to ask an important question. Is this history or is it pseudoscience? The problem was that nobody seems to have checked what was being added in the name of heritage. Let us go back to that master's degree in astrology for a moment. When it was launched in 2021, it wasn't introduced as a course on the history of astrology or its place in Indian culture. It was launched as part of India's national education policy and its push to promote Indian knowledge systems. Around the same time, something similar was happening in Madhya Pradesh. The state's higher education department introduced courses in Vedic rituals, astrology, Vedic science, and Vastu Shastra. Students were being trained in them as professional skills. Now, I don't think I need to convince most of you that astrology and Vastu doesn't work. Decades of scientific testing have already settled that question. So think about what that means. By 2021, public money, that is mine and yours, was being used to teach and award degrees in a subject that science had already rejected. And all this was happening while the same education system was struggling to teach millions of children basic reading and maths. And if you think that is the worst of it, it is not even close. The next example changes the stakes completely. Around the same time, something else was happening. While astrology and Vastu were finding their way into new courses, NCERT was removing some of the most important topics from the class 10 science syllabus. The periodic table was moved to class 11. Evolution was moved to class 12. Now, to be fair, NCERT didn't completely remove these topics. It said the changes were made to reduce overlap and ease the academic load after COVID. Technically, that is true. The periodic table is still taught in class 11 and evolution is still taught in class 12. But here is the problem. Most Indian students never study class 11 science. Many leave school after class 10. Others choose streams where these topics are never taught. So, for millions of students, moving these chapters to higher classes had the same effect as removing them altogether. That is why more than 1,800 scientists and educators, including many from IITs, IIScs, and IISers, signed an open letter opposing the removal of evolution from class 10. Now put these two facts side by side. At the same time that astrology was entering university classrooms, evolution, one of the most important ideas in all of biology, and the periodic table, a fundamental concept in chemistry, were disappearing from the last science class that many Indian students would ever attend. Pseudoscience came in through the front door. Real science quietly walked out through the back. Now imagine sitting across from a doctor. Most of us never stop to think about how they were trained because we simply assumed that everything they learned was tested against the best scientific evidence available. In 2023, the National Commission for Indian System of Medicine, the body responsible for setting the curriculum for Ayurveda colleges across India, added an astrology module to the Ayurveda syllabus. Now think about what that really means. This wasn't a history department discussing ancient ideas or cultural traditions. This was the curriculum used to train future healthcare practitioners, people who would go on to diagnose illnesses, prescribe treatments, and in some states, even prescribe modern medicines. Astrology had become part of that education. The Breakthrough Science Society opposed the move, but their objection wasn't really about astrology alone. It was about where we choose to draw the line. Teaching Sushruta's surgical writings as part of the history of medicine is perfectly legitimate. Teaching future health practitioners that astrology has a role in diagnosis is something entirely different, because eventually those ideas don't remain inside a classroom. They become part of how real patients are treated. The story doesn't end there. Around the same time, the University Grants Commission recommended that MBBS students should also take credit courses covering Ayurveda, Yoga, Unani, Siddha, and homeopathy. Here too, the important distinction is easy to miss. There is nothing wrong with medical students learning about these systems, their history, or even examining their claims scientifically. In fact, they should. But teaching a system as evidence-based medicine is a very different claim from teaching it as the history of medicine. And that is where the debate begins. The Indian Medical Association opposed the recommendation for much the same reason. Although they approached the issue from a different direction, they were ultimately making the same argument as the Breakthrough Science Society. Our medical history deserves to be studied honestly, but clinical practice must be guided by evidence. As I make this video, thousands of resident doctors across Maharashtra are on a strike over a bridge course that allows homeopathy practitioners to prescribe modern medicines. Supporters argue that it helps address shortages of healthcare professionals. The doctors' organizations argue that prescribing modern medicine requires the same scientific training and standards expected of every other doctor. Now, if homeopathy is as effective and scientific as they claim, why would they require to prescribe modern medicines? Now, whichever side you agree with, the bigger question remains the same. Where do we draw the line between studying traditional medicine and teaching doctors to use it on their patients? At the 2015 Indian Science Congress, a government minister claimed that Pythagoras hadn't really discovered the theorem named after him. According to him, it had been known in India centuries earlier, and Pythagoras had simply copied it. Now, that claim isn't supported by the evidence. But it is interesting because, like many exaggerated claims, it begins with something that is actually true. The Bauddhayana Sulba Sutra, a Sanskrit text on geometry written around 800 BCE, does describe the same mathematical relationship that we now call the Pythagorean theorem. That text is several centuries older than Pythagoras himself. It's a genuine historical text and an important part of India's mathematical heritage. Where the story changes is in the claim that Greece somehow stole this knowledge from India. Historians don't think that is what happened. The same mathematical relationship appears to have been discovered independently in several ancient civilizations, including Babylon, India, and Greece, because it naturally emerges once people begin studying geometry in a systematic way. And if you ask me, that is an even better story. It means India's contribution to mathematics stands on its own. It doesn't need a story about somebody else stealing it in order to be remarkable. Our myths and epics are an important part of India's cultural heritage. They deserve to be studied seriously as literature, philosophy, and religion. But they cannot, by themselves, serve as evidence that a particular scientific discovery or medical technique really existed. A story can tell us what people believed. It can tell us how they understood the world around them. What it cannot do is replace archaeological evidence, historical records, or scientific investigation. Those questions have to be answered using the methods of history and science, not the language of mythology. And this is where I think we often go wrong. Presenting mythology as science doesn't make our tradition stronger. It only puts India's real scientific achievements next to claims that have no evidence. Here is something that almost nobody talks about when they criticize Indian knowledge systems. The problem with the current IKS curriculum isn't that it teaches too much Indian philosophy. The real problem is that it leaves out one of India's own intellectual traditions, its tradition of skepticism. It was called the Charvaka or Lokayata school. Its thinkers questioned the authority of the Vedas, rejected supernatural explanations, and argued that claims should be accepted only when they were supported by direct evidence. In other words, India didn't just produce traditions of faith, it also produced traditions of doubt. And perhaps that is the greatest irony in this entire story. A curriculum that claims to teach India's knowledge systems has very little to say about one of India's own rationalist traditions. Many students may complete these courses without ever learning that Charvaka even existed. Buddhist and Jain traditions of logic receive comparatively little attention, and so do the writings of B.R. Ambedkar. Instead, the curriculum draws overwhelmingly from the Vedas, the Upanishads, and the great Sanskrit epics. The irony is that a curriculum meant to represent the many sides of Indian thought leaves out the very traditions that questioned authority and asked for evidence. And that is a remarkable omission, because if the Charvakas were alive today, they would probably have agreed with much of what we have discussed in this episode. So where does that leave us? The idea of teaching India's scientific heritage was never wrong. In fact, I think it is something we should do more often. India has made remarkable contributions to mathematics, astronomy, and linguistics, and these achievements deserve to be taught with pride, but they also deserve to be taught honestly, because history and science are not the same thing. History tells us what people believed, what they discovered, and how ideas changed over time. Science asks a very different question. It asks whether those ideas still stand up when we test them. And the moment we stop making that distinction, we end up teaching astrology alongside astronomy, mythology alongside history, and belief alongside evidence. India's real scientific achievements do not need to be decorated with extraordinary claims. Aryabhata, Panini, and the mathematicians of the Kerala school earned their place in history through ideas that changed the world. Their achievements are impressive enough on their own. If there is one thing that I would like you to take away from this episode, it is this. We should never be afraid to celebrate our heritage, but we should never be afraid to question it either, because that is how science works, and that is how knowledge grows. If you enjoyed this video, I think you will enjoy my earlier video, The Most Pseudoscientific Government in the World, where I look at how many of these same ideas found their way into politics and public life. If you found this video worth watching, do consider subscribing to Pale Blue Thoughts. And if you know someone who cares about science, education, or India's future, share this video with them. The best way to support the channel is simply to watch it till the end, hype, comment, and share. Every video on this channel takes weeks of research, writing, fact-checking, and editing. Your support gives me the time to keep doing that, and it allows me to make these videos free for everyone. And so, if you would like me to help make more of them, you can support my work through Patreon, buy me a coffee, or by becoming a YouTube member. Thank you for being here, and thank you to everyone who's already supporting the channel. It genuinely makes this work possible. Until next time, keep asking questions.